Although a clever man, Herbert Samuel has this strange shortcoming. He is organically a doctrinaire. What he sees is not real men as God created them, but some abstract human creatures. Having mentally produced such a personage, he then submits to him his arguments and demands, with results that should not be difficult to imagine. When he later became High Commissioner of Palestine, this characteristic of his caused considerable harm to us, the Arabs, and England's good name. On the 1st of July 1920, Sir Herbert Samuel landed at Jaffa, assuming a presumptive office as the League of Nations' first High Commissioner for Palestine. I say presumptive because the League of Nations hadn't given him the job yet. He'd actually been appointed to the position by British Prime Minister David Lloyd George. The Treaty of Sèvres partitioning the Ottoman Empire hadn't even been signed yet. But following the San Remo conference that April, it had been all but assured that a League of Nations mandate for Palestine would be placed under British administration in the years to come. So we need to answer the question, what's a League of Nations mandate? But before that, we have to answer the question, what's the British Empire? Leaving aside the United Kingdom itself, the British Empire in the 1920s was a patchwork of administrative regimes with radically different systems of governance. And to understand what was about to happen in Palestine, we need to go through them. But let's be clear, this isn't a universal guide to colonial empires. It's merely a description of the British Empire in the 1920s. Most of what I'm about to say would be completely out of date within a generation. But with that out of the way, the subject polities of the British Empire at this time were basically defined by three variables. Was it self-governing? Was the British king head of state? And were the people British subjects? Meaning, were they automatically eligible for British citizenship or to live and work in other parts of the empire? First up were the Crown colonies, which were pretty much what you imagine. The people were British subjects, the king was the head of state, and the most important politician was the British appointed governor, with local elected government being strictly limited or non-existent. Then you had the Dominions, places like Canada, Australia, and South Africa, most of which were large, remote, majority white, and had been unified from older, smaller colonies in order to be more manageable. As in the Crown colonies, citizens of the Dominions were British subjects with the king as their head of state, and were basically independent when it came to domestic policy. They still needed permission from the British Parliament to amend their constitutions, and were still subject to British foreign policy, but by the 1920s that had begun to change. In 1919, most of the Dominions broke from this policy by signing the Treaty of Versailles and getting their own seats in the League of Nations. By 1950, all of these countries would be fully independent. In addition to the Dominions, there were also Crown dependencies, which were basically the same, except that they were just some small islands and actually predated the British Empire, so we can ignore them. The other main form of British administration was the Protectorate. In theory, protectorates were independent countries who would outsource their defense and diplomacy to Britain. In practice, the amount of British control varied, but most importantly for our purposes, they had their own heads of state and the population weren't British subjects. Aside from all of that was India, which, actually, we'll come back to India later. The end of the First World War introduced yet another type of political entity, the League of Nations Mandate. These comprised Germany's former colonies in Africa and the Pacific, as well as the outlying, mostly non-Turkish regions of the Ottoman Empire. In keeping with the principles outlined by US President Woodrow Wilson in his 14 points, these territories were organized under the jurisdiction of the newly formed League of Nations, who would then elect the various allied powers to occupy these areas and establish institutions of democratic self-government with the goal of eventual independence. At least in theory. The US supported this plan for all of the mandates, and the British supported it for most of them, but under pressure from most of the other allies, the former German mandates were downgraded into colonies in all but name. Nevertheless, the original intention of the mandates remained in place for the outlying Ottoman territories, so from a British perspective, we can think of them as protectorates, or at least protectorates in the making. In April 1920, the San Remo Conference allocated mandates for Palestine and Iraq to Britain. It would still take a couple of years of negotiation until the mandates officially went into effect, but in reality, most of the major points for Palestine had already been agreed upon. and in a sense, this can be considered the first part of the Palestinian Constitution. Britain was officially tasked with creating a new Palestinian citizenship, a criminal and civil justice system, a national government with the power to nationalize public works, utilities, and natural resources, and a volunteer national army for purely defensive purposes. English, Arabic, and Hebrew were established as the official languages, and all religious holidays were guaranteed as work holidays for the relevant religious communities. While repeatedly guaranteeing political rights, freedom of religion, and non-discrimination, much of the mandate's language concerned the implementation of Palestine as a Jewish national home, calling for the future Palestinian government to contract a Jewish agency to facilitate Jewish immigration. The Ottoman ban on selling state-owned land to Jewish residents was abolished, and Jews in diaspora were guaranteed a right to apply for Palestinian citizenship, though the specifics of the process were left up to the future government. Now, you'll notice that all of this language uses the term Jewish national home, not Jewish state, and this was deliberate. At the time, there was no consensus regarding the Zionist movement's objectives. When Herzl called urgently for the creation of a Jewish state, he was very much in the minority, and that was still a minority position in 1920. With a few high-profile exceptions, the majority of Zionists believed that a Jewish state would take form eventually, and engaged with Zionism primarily as a cultural movement. Colonial Secretary Winston Churchill and British military leaders in the region believed that the process of Jewish nation-building in Palestine would take at least a century, and that Britain had only a small role to play in it. Lord Balfour of the Balfour Declaration argued that Britain should either try to bring another country in to share the mandate or withdraw as soon as possible. And Colonel Ronald Storrs, military governor of Jerusalem and a self-described Zionist, envisioned the Jewish homeland as only one part of a future pan-Levantine federation, a position shared by King Faisal of Iraq, Jerusalem Mayor Raghib al-Nashashibi, and Chaim Margalit Kalvarisky of the Jewish Colonization Association, the main person responsible for buying Arab-owned land in Palestine for Jewish agricultural settlement. Over the 1920s, this would coalesce into a distinct stream of Zionism known as binationalism. But the most concrete vision for the British mandate came from the newly appointed High Commissioner. Sir Herbert Samuel was Jewish, a Zionist, and a liberal with a capital L. In fact, during the war, he'd been the first ever Jewish member of the British cabinet. So almost inevitably, he took heavy inspiration from Ahad Ha'am, the first great Zionist philosopher, as well as one of the movement's loudest critics. When Theodor Herzl first proposed the creation of a Jewish state, Ahad Ha'am led the opposition. He correctly believed that a Jewish state couldn't exist within his lifetime. But more importantly, he feared the consequences of a rush toward political nationalism. He conceived of Zionism as an effort to break the cycle of oppression and religious fervor that had followed the Jewish people in diaspora. But as a general rule, people who have grown up under systems of oppression tend to struggle with rational self-government, often abusing the opportunity to become the new oppressors. What Zionism required instead was a steady process of nation-building through which future generations could establish a peaceful and prosperous state for all its citizens. In that spirit, Samuel's vision was for a mandate for Palestine lasting 50 years. Initially, Jewish immigration would be strongly restricted, but as the country became more politically and economically developed, those restrictions would loosen. In that time, he would pressure Zionist institutions to abandon aspirations for a Jewish state, thus initiating a slow normalization of Jewish and Arab coexistence. By 1970, Palestine's population would be majority Jewish, or nearly so, at which point a new generation of native-born politicians would lead the country into an independent, post-Zionist future. This perspective would inform all of Samuel's decisions as High Commissioner. Nothing was going to stop him from pursuing that vision. Which, maybe it should have. The very fact of Samuel being Jewish caused a great deal of alarm. He himself hesitated to accept the job for fear that the non-Jewish majority would be hostile to his governance by default, and certainly some share of the population was. But if anything, his Jewishness set him up for even more scrutiny from the Zionists. Samuel had worked closely with Zionist leaders before, but now he was just a public servant who answered to the League of Nations, the British Colonial Office, and the Palestinian public. Inevitably, he would have to make decisions that someone in the Zionist movement didn't like, and because they saw him as one of their own, those decisions would inspire far more outrage than if they'd been made by someone else. There was also the situation he was walking into. By the time of Samuel's arrival in July 1920, Palestine was recovering from the deprivations of the Great War, but descending into a new conflict. Just 3 months before his arrival, Jerusalem had erupted into a riot killing 9 people. And 10 months into his tenure, far worse riots erupted in Jaffa, killing 95. Meanwhile, the Zionist movement wasn't meeting its own expectations. Palestine's Jewish population was still less than it had been before the war. Between 1919 and 1923, only 7,500 Jews arrived in Palestine each year, the majority of whom were returning refugees who'd fled or been expelled during the war. Only about 1,000 arrivals each year were newcomers, claiming only a tiny fraction of the available immigration visas, and just as many of them were leaving the country. We call this period the Third Aliyah, but it was really a low point in the movement. The reasons for this were the same as before the war. Palestine was poor, unstable, and dangerous, and not just because of humans. In 1919, American Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis visited Palestine and was horrified by the ubiquity of malaria, a disease which he'd suffered as a child in Kentucky and which he held responsible for many of the country's other quality of life issues, but was so commonplace that most of the Yishuv had given up trying to fix it. Even now, his criticisms fell on deaf ears. On top of all that, Britain's support for the mandate system came from the fact that the country was broke from fighting the war and could no longer afford to expand its empire. To that point, Colonial Secretary Winston Churchill informed Samuel that Palestine's government would have to be fiscally self-sufficient. But none of this ran counter to Samuel's guiding principles. Unlike some other Zionists, he had no illusions about the seriousness of Arab nationalism in Palestine. But he also believed that any potential conflict could be contained and ameliorated through political conciliation, civic improvement, and economic development. First arriving in the wake of the Nebi Musa riots, he pardoned its alleged instigators, and even appointed one of them to the office of Grand Mufti, a sort of Muslim equivalent to the chief rabbi. When the Jaffa riots broke out, he temporarily suspended Jewish immigration and then permanently reduced the number of available visas. His next great task would be to create a Palestinian constitution that adhered to the letter of the Balfour Declaration, but would mitigate Arab opposition by creating a system of taxation and a professional bureaucracy to improve infrastructure and facilitate commerce, as well as an elected legislature that was responsive to the demands of the public, but not so responsive as to undermine the mandate itself. So, let's talk about India. India's administration was unlike anything else in the British Empire, or the world. Home to most of the empire's population, the majority of Indians lived in the presidencies and provinces, which were directly ruled by British officials and had a limited form of representative government, making them similar to crown colonies, while about a quarter lived in the princely states, ruled indirectly through local monarchs with large amounts of internal autonomy similar to protectorates. There were some important differences, though. Despite the differing systems of government, India was still one country. The princes were still subordinate to King George V in his role as Emperor of India, and all Indians were treated as British subjects. At the same time, India had signed the Treaty of Versailles separately from Britain and thus gained its own seat in the League of Nations, making it similar to a dominion. The man who'd signed the treaty on India's behalf was Edwin Samuel Montagu, Herbert Samuel's cousin and his former colleague in the British cabinet. Montagu was an anti-Zionist who had vehemently opposed the Balfour Declaration, partly on principle, partly because he feared it would be weaponized by a future reactionary government to deny citizenship to British Jews. But shortly before the declaration was issued, Montagu was appointed to serve as Secretary of State for India, whereafter he began a series of reforms to set the country on a path from an undemocratic patchwork regime to a full-fledged dominion like Canada or Australia. Bringing India into the League of Nations was only the beginning. In December 1919, Westminster issued a new constitution based on Montagu's recommendations that expanded India's nascent legislature into the 145-seat Legislative Assembly and the 60-seat Council of State. This constitution is deeply problematic in many ways. The princely states notably paid the price of autonomy by not having any representation. necessitating the creation of a third body known as the Chamber of Princes. And indeed, the Indian National Congress boycotted every general election until 1934. But there were some interesting ideas. In addition to elected seats, both chambers of parliament had a sizable minority of appointed seats to secure representation for certain minorities and economic sectors, and ensure that British influence on the political process remained more than token, but less than absolute. Furthermore, the Constitution guaranteed a process by which it would be periodically replaced to gradually make the system more democratic and autonomous. Despite their differences over Zionism, Samuel and Montagu had otherwise similar politics, family ties, and had basically grown up together. So Montagu wrote to his cousin wishing him the best and hoping that he might create a constitution for Palestine in the same spirit that Montagu had for India. Since taking office, Samuel had relied on an advisory council comprising himself, 10 British officials, and 10 local politicians representing the Muslim, Jewish, and Christian communities. As a matter of courtesy, the 11 Britons never voted against a majority decision by the 10 Palestinians, but this arrangement was clearly unsatisfactory. So following the disastrous Jaffa riots, Churchill proposed the creation of a 26-member parliament. Just as in India, locals would make up the majority and the parliament's decisions would be legally binding, though they wouldn't be able to pass laws violating the text of the mandate. And just as in India, the constitution would be periodically updated as part of a gradual transition to full self-government. Over the next year, Samuel began working with the Advisory Council, the Colonial Office, and various advisors in London. And on the 10th of August 1922, the King's Privy Council issued the Palestine Ordering Council. Before diving in, this won't be a comprehensive analysis of the Constitution because, to be honest, a lot of it isn't important. A lot of it just repeated stuff that was in the League of Nations mandate, outlined mundane responsibilities that would be expected of any modern government, or dealt with really specific issues of jurisdiction between Palestine and the British Empire. If you're really curious, the full text is linked in the description. Under the Constitution, the High Commissioner was both head of state and head of government, and was bound to carry out all the laws passed by the future Palestinian legislature and any future orders in council from Westminster. He had the unilateral privilege of reorganizing Palestine into districts and sub-districts for the purposes of administration, with a particular emphasis on criminal justice. Significantly, the commissioner had unilateral power to oversee the sale or lease of state-owned land and the granting of licenses to manage public utilities and extract natural resources. The High Commissioner would also have a seat on the Legislative Council, alongside 12 elected representatives and 10 members of the cabinet, which is notably more conservative than what Churchill had proposed. The commissioner would be responsible for establishing a system of criminal and civil courts, but matters of personal status, like marriage and divorce, fell almost exclusively under the jurisdiction of religious courts, just as they had in the Ottoman Empire, leading Attorney General Norman Bentwich to quip that Palestine's legal system was not Mosaic, but a-Mosaic. Tucked away toward the end was a clause stating that the Constitution didn't apply to those parts of Palestine east of the River Jordan, which is going to take some explaining. During the Paris Peace Conference, the British pushed for a Sharifian solution to the partition of the Levant and Mesopotamia. Rather than divide the Ottoman territories up as the spoils of war, Britain and France would only take some small coastal enclaves, while the remainder would be divided between King Faisal of Syria and 2 of his brothers. But in the course of negotiations, the plan was quashed by France, who insisted on taking all of northern Syria as its own League of Nations mandate. So in 1921, British and Arab representatives met in Cairo to come up with a second Sharifian solution, whereby the deposed Faisal would become king of Iraq, while his brother Abdullah would be made emir of the Transjordan, which would be under Palestinian suzerainty but distinct from Palestine itself. This would come into effect in 1923, outraging certain elements of the Zionist movement, but this arrangement had been a long time coming. Elections to the Legislative Council would have to take place at least every 3 years, with the first elections set for February 1923. But the nature of those elections were only outlined in a second ordering council issued alongside the first. Since Palestinian citizenship didn't exist yet, Eligibility for voting was extended to those who still held Ottoman citizenship or applied for provisional Palestinian citizenship before the end of October. Otherwise, the laws and procedures of the election followed the template established by the Ottoman Empire. Voting would be open to men over the age of 25, and rather than a direct vote, the elected legislators would be chosen by an electoral college. Following a national census in October, Palestine was organized into 127 voting areas from which voters would choose electors, who would then organize themselves on the basis of religion and hold a second vote for the 12 legislators, 2 for Christians, 2 for Jews and Samaritans, and 8 for Muslims, Druze, and everyone else. And that was the Constitution of Palestine. So, what the f***? In 1918, Samuel had spearheaded legislation enabling women to serve in the British Parliament. Why then deny voting rights to Palestinian women, or to men under 25? Why create a confusing electoral college with seats allocated on the basis of religion when a simple popular vote would produce roughly the same results? Why have only 12 elected representatives rather than the 15 proposed by Churchill? Why did a constitution guaranteeing freedom of conscience continue forcing residents to deal with religious authorities? Why was the age of consent still 13? Yes, most of those things were holdovers from the Ottoman Empire, but why choose to keep them? The Ottoman Empire was gone. Most people considered that a good thing. In reality, Samuel didn't have complete freedom to write the constitution as he wanted. When it came to dealing with London, the job of High Commissioner turned out to be less like a colonial governor and more like a lobbyist for the Palestinian government. Most of his underlings in Jerusalem were no better. Civil service in Palestine generally attracted a certain type, someone who engaged with the country primarily as the land of the Bible and the Crusades and tended to romanticize, for lack of a better term, Middle Eastern backwardness. So while most of these laws were unpopular, there were enough British administrators who felt that getting rid of them would be culturally inauthentic. Not coincidentally, a lot of these administrators were also raging anti-Semites who resented Samuel's efforts at modernization and wrote them off as a Jewish perversion of the nobly simple Arab way of life. And yes, that included raising the age of consent. Clearly that would be perverted. I also take it that Samuel and company weren't very good at math, because this constitution's version of the Electoral College created situations in which low voter turnout would produce too few electors, thus incentivizing boycotts. And that's exactly what happened. During the war, Arab nationalists in Palestine had begun organizing local Muslim Christian associations, who in 1919 began a regular gathering known as the Palestine Arab Congress. This wasn't a political organ like the Jewish Assembly of Representatives. Its members weren't elected and were pretty much all wealthy elites. It was essentially an Arab answer to the now vestigial Zionist Congress back in Europe, a forum for local politicians and self-appointed activists. Officially, the Congress objected to the formation of a legislature in which Muslims weren't an absolute majority, but in practice they opposed the Electoral College, since they couldn't presume to know the outcome of an election conducted by a simple popular vote. And a simple popular vote was good enough for the British mandate in Iraq, why not here? So just 12 days after the issuing of the Constitution, the Congress passed resolutions rejecting it and calling for a boycott of the 1923 elections. Now, the Congress was starkly divided on issues of Palestine's political status and covered a broad spectrum of anti-Zionism. They were also opposed by the softly pro-Zionist Muslim national associations and were beginning to lose ground to the Jewish anti-Zionist MOPS, now rebranded as the Palestine Communist Party. Because of this, a lot of Zionist politicians underestimated the Congress's influence, but it still had a lot. So when the general election was held in February, Samuel was horrified by a voter turnout of just 20.1%. Even among Jews, it was only 50%. In the Southern District, turnout among Arabs was somewhere around 0, which broke the Electoral College and made appointing a full legislative council impossible. Admitting defeat, Samuel suspended the Legislative Council, instead expanding the Advisory Council to include 12 Palestinian members in anticipation of a new election sometime in the near future. The 2 Jewish members would have to be elected by the Assembly of Representatives, but before that could happen, 7 of the 10 Arab councilmen withdrew, ending any semblance of a Palestinian parliament. At this point, the duties of the government were limited to taxation, immigration, civil and criminal justice, roads, railways, the postal service, establishing a free public education system, combating health crises like the aforementioned malaria, confirming the appointments of chief religious leaders, managing state-owned land, and contracting private companies for the operation of public utilities and the extraction of natural resources. That sounds like a lot, but most of these responsibilities were carried out through some type of partnership. While the government funded and standardized public education, the schools themselves were still operated by local or religious authorities. Addressing the malaria crisis was almost entirely dependent on foreign NGOs, and tax collection was performed indirectly through local officials, making graft inevitable. The issuing of immigration visas was a responsibility of the Ministry of Customs and Revenue, but finding housing, education, and work for Jewish immigrants was left to the Zionist executive, led by former British Colonel Frederick Kish. In matters where the government had exclusive jurisdiction, progress was slow but hopeful. Initially, the civil service was mostly made up of whomever the government could find off the street, but as the years progressed, the service gradually professionalized and nativized. Though while Palestinians never made up less than 90% of the civil service, the offices of Chief Justice, Attorney General, and Inspector General were always filled by Britons. However, there remained large areas in which the Palestinian government was never able to fulfill its duties. Even the earliest drafts of the mandate had tasked the High Commissioner with establishing a national military, the Palestine Defense Force. But this force was dissolved shortly after the Jaffa riots, when 1st Judeans commander Eliezer Margolin had helped Jewish militias steal British weapons. A small battalion lived on in the Transjordan, but to the dismay of the Colonial Office, all military operations in Palestine proper would continue to be run and paid for by Westminster. After years of delay by French and Italian negotiators, the League of Nations mandate for Palestine finally came into effect in September 1923. But even at this late date, there was still no Palestinian citizenship, nor was there a central bank or a national currency. It didn't even have a flag. Samuel agonized over a design that would represent the country as a whole without including ethnically or religiously specific imagery, but quickly gave up. The red ensign that I and others often use to represent this period is the Civil Maritime Ensign. Meanwhile, in Westminster, political support for the mandate was reaching an all-time low. The first half of the 1920s was a period of political realignment in Britain, with Labour beginning to displace the Liberals as a major party. And while Labour was generally more pro-Zionist than the other parties, the process of realignment temporarily gave the Conservatives an electoral advantage. So in July 1923, Britain's new Prime Minister and Colonial Secretary ordered a secret commission to investigate whether Britain could or should renounce the Balfour Declaration. Their conclusions were revealing. The committee was unable to come to a decision over the Balfour Declaration itself. They reasoned that it had been made in a fit of wartime desperation, and that it would be impossible to reconcile the assurance of a Jewish national home with the principles of self-determination with regard to Palestinian Arabs. However, they also felt that such considerations were irrelevant. The provision of a Jewish national home was now part of international law, enshrined in the Treaty of Sèvres and affirmed by the League of Nations. To renege on international law would make Britain a global pariah, and to do so while still occupying Palestine would be worse still. For the League of Nations to transfer the mandate to an expansionist France or Italy would be a crime against the Palestinian people, Jew and Arab alike, and to simply abandon the land would make it easy prey for a resurgent Turkey. The only hope, they argued, was to make assurances to the Arab majority through the creation of an Arab agency equivalent to the Jewish National Council, but the Palestine Arab Congress rejected this too. Otherwise, Britain could only hope for the best, continue efforts toward reconciliation, and maintain Palestine's economic development. At this point, the ascendant binationalist movement gained its most high-profile member. Ze'ev Jabotinsky was right. Sir Herbert Samuel had been the wrong man for the job. But his greatest weakness wasn't his ideology or his decisions, but the fact that he was the one making them. Having a high commissioner who was Jewish and a Zionist offended Arab nationalists and Zionists in equal measure. Part of the reasoning behind his appointment had been to avoid the optics of placing a British Christian in charge. But in hindsight, we know that the Palestinian public would have given a British Christian a lot more benefit of the doubt. This isn't theoretical. We're gonna see it happen. But this is where things get funny. After 2 years of escalating violence, the majority of the 1920s were remarkably quiet. Despite calls by the Arab Congress for a boycott of Jewish goods, commerce between Jews and Arabs increased, and Jewish-led labor movements began to make inroads with Arab workers. The mid-1920s saw a surge of Jewish immigration and unprecedented amounts of foreign investment in Palestine, bringing new infrastructure and economic development. By 1923, Palestine's Jewish population had rebounded to pre-war levels, and instead of inflaming tensions, there was nothing. Just 2 years after rioting resulted in the almost total segregation of Jaffa, Jewish families were beginning to return to their old neighborhoods. The Zionist movement was becoming more and more divided, with a growing binationalist movement featuring Jews and Arabs. The temperature was going down. Samuel's 50-year plan was working. So complete were the folly of his appointment and the failure of his constitution that they had united Jews and Arabs around a common enemy. Special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, FC, Matthew Feinberg, Jay Fleischman, Oshar Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Sol Cohn, Jacob Kossoff, Eric Liederman, and Jeffrey Schweitzer.